This is Talk Radio Europe.
Live on Éire, presented by Sweeney.
The other day, a beautiful book landed on my desk, put together by John Breslin and Sarah Ann Buckley, and it's Old Ireland in Colour 3. It's the third edition of this, and in this volume, Sarah Ann and John uncover more photographic gems with some great stories to accompany them. And the book comprises 161 images that cover a key period in Irish life from the famine to the late 1960s. I am thrilled to say that co-author Sarah Ann Buckley joins me from Galway via Zoom. Sarah Ann, it's lovely to talk to you, and thank you for joining me today on the programme. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Ger.
Not at all. It's lovely to talk to you, and congratulations to you and John. This is a fabulous, fabulous book. And while I may not know the people involved, but it brings back memories of a time, if that makes sense to you.
It does. It's something we've heard in the feedback, that there is a feeling that people get when they're looking at these images. So I'm just delighted again with the reaction. It's been fantastic.
And do you know what struck me as well when I, very early on in the book, and even just looking at the colour, looking at photographs from my grandparents' time and looking at photographs that my mum would have at home of, you know, mum and dad when they were younger and weddings and things like that, everything looks dull and dreary and drab because it's black and white. But the colour that you've put into this, you haven't done anything with it. You haven't taken any liberties, I'm sure. You've just put the colour in. And Ireland in those days is a lot more colourful, a lot more sunny, a lot brighter than I thought it was.
Well, that's the main aim of the project. It's to just, I suppose, show Ireland as it was. People did live their lives in colour. You know, the painting had colour, their clothing had colour, their eyes had colour. I often quote one of the readers who said to us, her grandson asked her, did she remember Ireland when it was in black and white?
Yeah. And
I think that's really interesting. John does a lot of work on bringing these images to life. Sometimes it's enhancing them, even restoring them. Some of them can look incredibly, as you say, dull. And so there's a lot of work that goes into that. And then I get the pleasure of helping him with the research, be it into eye colour or clothing or whatever it is. And then I get to write these captions that hopefully, I suppose, lead people down some of the rabbit holes and that they actually want to find out more about that person or that place. So it's been a great project that way.
You jumped ahead of me ever so slightly because I was going to ask you about your respective roles. But before I do that, those that are fortunate enough to have this book in their hand get to read a little piece about who you are and what you do and who John is. So would you talk us through that? Maybe start with yourself. Tell us your background and what you do.
I'm originally from Cove in Cork, and I did my PhD in history in UCC, and I'm working as a lecturer in history and now associate professor in Galway since 2012. So I look a lot at social history, but especially the history of women and children. And I suppose I do a lot of history from below, so everyday life in the 19th and the 20th century. John is actually a professor of engineering. He actually was one of the founders of boards.ie and adverts.ie, and he has like a number of very big European projects. But this project was his. He began by colorizing family photographs. He was interested in genealogy, and he really is very good at social media. So he set up the accounts, Old Ireland in Colour. There was so much interest that people started asking him, you know, when was the book coming? They'd love to see these not just on Instagram. So I suppose one fact, John and I didn't meet in person until after the second book.
You're
because
kidding.
Because of COVID. We shouldn't even mention it, but he emailed me and we did the work virtually. But we're both in the University of Galway.
And how did this idea come about? Was it your idea that you approached him and said, you can do this part, or was it vice versa? Or did someone say to both of you, you'd be great at doing this together, off you go and do it?
One email from John, he actually looked at the history department's webpage and he could see my interests in 19th, 20th century Ireland, again, even though we do have like a lot of famous or, well-known people, there is still that ordinary everyday life. And that is some of what I work in. So he sent me an email in 2020. It was in March 2020. And we had the first book out that Christmas was like the first book. So it's really, I was so delighted to see the email because public history, it's very unusual to be able to get the amount of people that we've had interested in this really, big time period. And for me as a historian, it's just been so amazing to see that. Yeah.
And for those that I'm going to recommend this book highly, obviously, and I'm going to go in search of the first two books. But for those who don't have the first two books as yet, will you tell me what do you deal with in those two?
For all books, the time period is very similar.
Okay.
Because photography, the first photographs of Ireland were from 1841. So that's really the starting point then, because there are actually tens of thousands of images that are available. But we very much focus, as you said, from the period of the Great Famine up to when colour photography was probably very popular. So we go up to the late 60s. So for the first book, we stopped in 1969 and it's been similar. I suppose we would say we went from the Great Famine to the period known as the Troubles. There's so much change and transformation in that time period, as lots of people will know. We decided to look at it thematically. I was the president of the Women's History Association of Ireland before. I'm really conscious of, gender, of social class, all of these things. So we wanted that represented. So kind of ensured that our sections address politics, working life. We had in the first book actually just a section on women and children.
Okay.
We've changed that now and we've put it the whole way through, which is a development. But the first book, it just got a lot of interest. We probably had more images of the west of Ireland because that is what John had been working on.
Okay.
And we probably had more of the islands. In the second book, we covered all 32 counties consciously. So that was another big kind of change between the two. The big change with this third book is actually John has been building up his own archive, buying photographs at auctions. So some of the images in this, we call them the unseen, but they really have not been seen. And each book has kind of developed that way. We've been learning and we've been trying to add something different, I guess.
Can I go through some of the categories that you have in the book, and we'll talk about a few things that I've picked out, if that's all right. And you've got politics, you've got childhood, working, social, global, and place. And I suppose the two that would be extremely interesting to me would be the social and the global, which we'll come to. But we'll take them in order if we can go along that way. And something that struck me very early on page 23, there is a picture of an eviction scene. And evictions and there was a big court case, you will recall, relating to an eviction a couple of years back, just recently. Evictions and landlords and homelessness very much to the fore in Ireland at the moment. But the eviction scene, the amount of policemen that were in attendance and the gathering for the tiny little house and for the few sticks of furniture that might have been in there, it was very heavy, wasn't it?
It was. And I think what maybe people aren't aware of is these were events that were coming for a number of weeks. So you just said it there. In that image, there's actually no window, like the windows, the doors, that was something that was often, or the furniture might all be taken.
Yeah.
And the families or the local kind of whoever's involved in the Planet campaign would be trying to ward off or keep control. Like that was a very good house in 1888. And we had a lot of information on it because the Freeman's Journal had been covering it in the newspaper. It's in Clare and it's right in the middle, as I say, of the Planet campaign. As with we had another eviction scene in another book, and we had an image of a group of sisters who were really active in trying to defend their property.
Yeah.
Here again, we have quotes in, and I just put one in the caption from one of the young women basically saying, that Balfour, if he sent he has sent smaller armies.
Yes.
Then he has to kind of turf out these old men and women. We have this paper evidence that goes with it, but it's a very intimidating and emotive picture, I think.
It is.
And we know a lot about the uniforms, obviously, and the colours there. So there's lots of things that we kind of have access to when it comes to the sources, but definitely the newspapers around this time and how they document the scene is like really important.
I wasn't going to delve into the various people in the politics section, but it's lovely to see photographs of the likes of Roger Casement and various people like that. But I just want to make one comment on Maud Gonne in Paris, and I looked at it and I thought, how did she live in such clutter? And it's all beautiful stuff. It's, big ornate stuff. She's there with a big dog in her apartment or her house in Paris. It's phenomenal, isn't it, to look at it? It gives you a great sense of the woman as well.
Honestly, that has, and particularly some of my female friends, they love that image. One of them, I'm actually getting it done for Christmas for her.
Really?
She says, I just love this. Because often the images we see of Maud Gonne, they aren't in this type of setting. It's obviously quite opulent. John had to do a lot of research into the painting, into, her dog, all these different pieces. But I think it reflects like where she was at that stage in her life.
Yes.
And sometimes, particularly coming out of the decade of centenary, we've had a big focus on maybe a 10, 15-year period with a lot of these individuals. You go a bit later, and, you're seeing, what they're doing in their lives in the 1930s and onwards. And we have like one of the only images of Daniel O'Connell. Even the quality's not very good, but to have that there, or to have like Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa on his deathbed, these types of images, I think are really iconic. And some of them we're not as familiar with.
When I was going to school, I learned that the connection between Liberty Hall and the proclamation, and Liberty Hall was originally the Northumberland Hotel. Then came on, it was then the headquarters of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. And as I was reading the little piece that you had written on it, it reminded me that that's actually the location of where the proclamation was printed. And then when you turn the page and you see it's wrecked, and you think, oh, proclamation was printed there. And look at it. For the first time in my life, it was a different connection between the proclamation and Liberty Hall.
That's it. Like, we were going to include that image in the second book, actually. The selection at the end is very difficult. It's very difficult for us to pick. We had two images in the first book of the GPO and around the GPO, in the days after the rising. And I think when you see that, like with the Liberty Hall image, the destruction, it does something else to our brains, I guess. And what we've found a lot is people have said to us that they are a bit more empathetic when they see it in colour and they see it like that, and kind of there's a bit more understanding of the context as well. Because we're not just taking the image, we're trying to give the caption there to give the context, but the image is what hits you first. And what you just did there, connecting it with something that you in the past that you yourself had considered. I think that it's the new insights it can bring then.
It is very much so. And I'm going to leave politics after this. And I said I wasn't going to dwell on people, but you can't not talk about probably the last picture ever taken of Michael Collins in the car on his way to Belnablaw. And little did he know that was probably his final journey. Again,
the quality of the image probably isn't like the best, but to have it, that really, that day, that really kind of iconic moment. And we've other images of him where they're far more staged or, they're far more familiar to us. Yeah. But a lot of what we've tried to include is those moments. So maybe the image won't be the most spectacular that was ever taken, but that moment is really important. I think that one's one that I'm really glad we left in there.
Absolutely. Let's move on to childhood, and we could talk about each of the individual pictures that you have, but you've given a great sense of the fact that children had fun in the dark and the black and white days, number one. Number two, you gave a great sense of where they belonged and how they belonged within their setting. And we're coming up to Halloween. I was going to say Christmas. We're coming up to Halloween next week. And one of the things that struck me, I was doing something else for the program around the same time I was looking through the book, and I was doing something about the fairies, that we talk about, and the traditions around Halloween. And I see on page 86 a photograph of 3 children, and the 3 boys are wearing skirts or petticoats, as you call them in the description. And I thought, wow. And then I read it, and there was something to do with the fact that it was a belief at the time that by wearing a petticoat, the children under 12 were safe from fairies. Am I right?
So that is it. The folklore at the time was that most boys were viewed as more important than girls to the economy of the family and for other reasons. So the skirts were a way of kind of ensuring up to the age of 12 anyway, that they were more protected. So that's the one that we have from the National Folklore Collection, which is an amazing collection. When we look at these sources, the other is that skirts were easier to make, or petticoats.
Of course.
So if you consider making trousers at the time, and also when they were younger, even for toilet training, skirts were easier. But certainly the folklore tells us that there was very real concerns. I don't think we view the fairies now as they were viewed, particularly in the 19th
feared,
century.
Weren't they? Yeah, they were to be feared.
Yeah, and if you look at like the folklore collection and some of the accounts from the 1930s, there was real fear around them. So we don't just use the sources from history. We have to think about what the traditions were at the time and what people believed. And that's a really big part of the work we're trying to do.
There's one here, it's a double page, and it's the 3 Merry Maids of Drogheda. And if anybody wants to see childhood in a nutshell, you've got beauty, you've got divilment, you've got fun, you've got laughter, you've got joy, happiness, wonder. Everything is in the faces of those 3 little girls, isn't it?
And see what happens though, sometimes when it's an image that isn't, we don't know who they are. We have found out throughout all the books, some of those individuals or their families have come to us. And it's amazing when they find us and we find them. The boy on the cover of the book, his daughter saw the cover of the book, Siobhan. She emailed the publisher to ask just for a copy of it. But we said, is your dad, where is your dad? And Kevin O'Connor is over in Birmingham. He's 79, nearly 80. And he came over to Galway for our launch a few weeks ago.
Fantastic.
Which was just the most amazing thing. So.
Oh, brilliant. All right, I'm going to move on and I want to talk about working, the section I'm working, but I'm not going to go through the individual pictures. But you've got everything there, from saving the hay to the early Garda Síochána, to gathering turf and bringing turf, to and fro, and also Aer Lingus. And when you consider you've just got 100 years and you've got everything from, working in the land to flying.
Yeah, I love, and they're like Civil Connolly designed the uniforms. So like the uniforms are amazing, but it gives me a chance then as a historian to actually say, the first flight was, late 1930s and then, so it opens up a bigger picture. And yeah, Ireland was primarily rural until 1950. So, a lot of the images are, rural images, but we do have those urban ones, as you said, or the sea, or later on the air. But it's great to see the diversity of it. So I love that working section, yeah. Listeners
will know that I'm not a soccer fan and I know absolutely nothing about it, but I know what FC Barcelona is all about. But what I didn't know is that an Irishman by the name of Patrick O'Connell has been titled the saviour of FC Barcelona. And there's a picture of him here. I thought that was a Kilkenny jersey when I looked at it firstly, but it's not. Tell me about Patrick O'Connell, please. Neither John nor myself have a great knowledge of sports. So
we always have to make sure we have enough sports history in there, because we know that other people rightly do.
We'll want them, yeah.
Patrick O'Connell, really interesting. And this one of those moments where, as well, I often say to people, go to the back of the book where there's references, because there's probably a book there that will give you the fuller picture, which when it comes to him, I would say is the case. The question in that caption is whether he actually was the saviour of Barcelona.
That's right,
FC.
I saw that.
He's being credited with like saving the club and fundraising and going on this tour of like South America and North America. There's some questions as to whether that was just really, over-egged, that piece. And locally, there's a professor that says, no, he didn't do all that, and he was actually a bit of a divil. But we do have a book from one of his relatives. So what I tried to do in the captions is weigh up that evidence and try and encourage people to look further. So when I was finishing off that caption, we had a big question as to whether to have the question mark there or not. He had a really interesting life, though, personally as well as professionally. And I think that there's very few people in Ireland who know about him. Now, he died in London and not in the best of circumstances.
Yes.
But his whole life, both as a player, a manager, in different clubs, it gives you a sense of the drama that was even attached to soccer at that point. So I'm glad, even if you don't have an interest in soccer, that you found the caption.
Absolutely. Well, again, I'm always looking for connections between Spain and Ireland. I can't remember whether I was looking at something daft like an Agatha Christie who done it, or whether I read something or it was a documentary. But I saw something that you brought to life in the pages under the I See Dead People heading.
Yes.
Where people who had passed away, they were positioned in places like armchairs, like there is now, and people, their family members sat in beside them or lay on the bed beside them and had their photograph taken. But to make it realistic, they painted the eyes on the eyelids. It's kind of spooky, but I've heard of it. So, queer tradition.
It's a Victorian era tradition. Would have emanated first in England, was popular in the US, and that image is from Ireland, but I don't think it was that common in an Irish context. It's known as death photography or post-mortem photography. It was actually seen as being a very big tribute. If you could afford to get that photograph taken to memorialize someone, because I think we forget how few people actually were photographed, particularly in the latter half of the 19th century. So it was seen as being a tribute and a way that the family could remember that person. Today, I think it seems very morose, and I don't think culturally we feel connected to that image. It's very strange, but I think it's really interesting to acknowledge that for, a number of decades, it was a practice that occurred. You can see, and it's been written about more in the US, but you can see adverts from photographers. You can see, that it's a service that people are looking to have. But it wasn't as common in the Irish context, but this is from Ireland. Yeah.
Let me just comment on the fact that I loved the photograph on page 168. Again, it's kind of sport, but it's hobby related. And that is Spot the Ball. And the photograph, 2 photographs of Fran Crowley from County Cork in mid-flight or mid-air while playing road bowls. And a lot of people in France and Spain would know about bowls, regular bowls, but this is a tradition very much associated with Cork, isn't it?
It is. So it's something I remember from when I was younger in Cove on a Sunday. And I didn't realise that it wasn't commonplace everywhere. So that's kind of the interesting piece, like that it's Armagh and it's Cork primarily that it had a presence. Yeah. So, and it's not even, obviously they're not even connected in regards to geography.
No.
But that's where it was most common. And I just included a quote from Dr. John Buckley. It is more than a sport. It is a subculture with its own language and traditions. And I think, as I say, sometimes there are traditions that are just very limited regions on the island. And I think it's good to kind of acknowledge them. But also the fact that the photographer caught him like mid-air, I think is really, really cool.
And a photograph from in front and behind, which is terrific. I'm going to move on quickly because you've been very kind. We're going into the global section and the two Elizas. I was fascinated with this. We've got County Limerick, Charleville and County Cork, yes.
Yeah.
And you've got Missouri and Paraguay. I leave it to you, the tale of the two Elizas.
Sometimes what I love is John will present me images and I had not heard of these two women. And I love that they're in there and we put them together. So Lola Montez, who was born Eliza Rosanna Gilbert from Limerick. So she was actually an Irish-born Spanish dancer. So like you can see that in the image and in her costume. She had some temper on her. I can say now sometimes that's just how women are written about at a particular time. Mm-hmm. She broke the nose of a manager in a theatre with a candlestick. Okay. So she is like this fiery Irish woman and she's like a Spanish dancer. So that's our first Eliza. Our second one, she's also really interesting. Unofficially known as the Queen of Paraguay. And I think hers is a story where kind of like social class is interesting because she falls in love with Francisco Solana Lopez, who's a billionaire heir to the presidency of Paraguay. There's loads of political conflict at the time. They can't like legitimize their relationship, but she is like the people's choice in Paraguay. She really associates with those of the lower social classes and they really like respect her. Like she has to flee in the end. He actually does become like the king of Paraguay, but her son dies and she has to flee with her 5 children that survived. So these connections with like Paraguay, with, you know, parts of the US, I think we don't know a lot about these, but the images are also beautiful. So yeah, they're the two Elizas. You
can tell a story about something, but in this case, I think you have to see it to appreciate it. And that's the story of Albert DJ Cashier, who was born Jenny Irene Hodgers.
Albert Cashier is one of 400 documented cases of soldiers who fought in the Civil War, who were born women, but who actually participated as male soldiers. So like 400 documented that actually, you know, were in battle, who went through kind of all of the drama, were injured. So how this actually came to light is after an accident in 1912, he was forced into sheltered accommodation. And that's when they realized what his birth gender was. But he actually had a pension. I'm using he because that's what he Albert. He was Albert throughout that whole time. So actually had a lot of rights that women at the time wouldn't have had. And I think it's just such an interesting case, and died in 1915. But that's the Irish woman, Irish man, Albert Cashier.
Lovely to see as well something that you wouldn't associate necessarily with Irish people of the day. And that's Nanette de Valois, I think is how you pronounce it. And she was a ballet dancer, but she wasn't born Nanette. Tell us about her.
I love this image actually just because it's also really beautiful. And it's actually, we know because it's based on a painting, we know the dress and the colours and everything about it. She actually goes on to be the founder of the Royal Ballet School. She's born Edristanis near Blessington, County Wicklow, and has, I suppose, a more well-to-do background than maybe, you know, so a gentry background. But the fact that we just know so little about her, and she goes on to set up one of the biggest ballet companies in the world, I think is really interesting. And she had like a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth II. She's just like a really kind of one of the most famous names associated with ballet, and she's Irish. So yeah, that's another one of our global Irish. It was actually my favourite section because there was so much in it.
There is, isn't there? There is. I've skipped one or two that I'd picked out, but purely for time. But this one I just wanted to mention at page 205. Doug Wrongway Corrigan. I want to hear about that, please. This is a brilliant story.
Douglas Corrigan, how he got his name was that He put together his own plane. He put it together from spare parts. He couldn't even see out the windshield, which, not great.
Not great,
He wanted to do a transatlantic flight. He didn't get permission to do that flight. So he said that he had just gone the wrong way and made his way. That was his story, and he was sticking to it. But it's fairly understood or accepted now that he knew what he was doing. Okay. And he wanted to make that flight, and he wanted to come to Ireland, and he just did it without permission at the time. So Doug Wrongway Corrigan, that's great. It's certainly, and there's a few actually images around aviation and that I think, we are kind of, we obviously have something there. The Irish diaspora must have some kind of it's obviously the island mentality. We feel that we need to learn how to get off it.
It probably is. Now, the one thing, this is the final one, if that's all right, and we're moving on to place, and there are some beautiful pictures here and associated with various people and that. But this is somebody that I think a lot of people will be familiar with, a man by the name of Tom Crean. And being Irish, one of the first questions we will ask another Irish person if we meet them anywhere in the world is, where are you from yourself? Or if you wander into a strange parish and you have an Irish accent, you'll be asked him, where are you from yourself? And I thought that this picture was lovely because when you consider what Tom Crean did and what he's associated with, to see in one picture the tiny little spot in the world that he came from, it says so much about him just in one picture. And we know the pictures tell 1,000 words and all that. But this is a beautiful picture.
It is. It's a beautiful image of Anniscall in County Kerry, where Tom Crean is from. He was such a humble man in so many ways, that actually looking at the village like this gives you a real sense. Like, for people who don't know as much about him, he enlisted in the British Royal Navy, without his parents' permission. This is before the amazing expeditions that he took part in. Then he comes back to Anniscall. And, as people may visit there, the South Pole Inn, he took that open and reopened it in 1929. So Anniscall is a really big part of his early years, but also later on. So we really thought it would be good this time to actually give that image of the place, because we have these beautiful images of him in the other books that show him, with Sally's pups when he's on one of the expeditions. So it's in 1915 when you think about what's going on in Ireland at the time. Absolutely. And it's just this very serene kind of landscape.
You're lucky that there are only 161 pictures in the book, because I've picked out a few and we've managed to chat for 40 minutes nearly. It's a smashing book. It's called Old Ireland in Colour. Sarah Ann Buckley I've been chatting to. She's co-author with John Breslin. And just to say to you, Sarah Ann, that our listeners can pick that up on our website, because we have a link there we have a virtual bookstore, and they can get their hands on that. And for anybody that has any Irish connections or any thoughts of, Ireland and history, just buy it and have a look at it. You'll get immersed in it and just get lost. It's fabulous.
Thanks so much, Stuart. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for talking about the book.
An absolute joy. And listen, I hope that a lot of people find it in their Christmas stock. And I know we're talking about Christmas, but it's only 2 months away. Listen, thanks a million, Sarah Ann, for talking to us.
Thanks, Stuart. Take care.
Live on Éire, presented by Sweeney.